Last week, Dr. Bronowski described his time at Cambridge, when the conjunction of the arts and sciences seemed the most natural thing in the world, and suggested that if man begins with doubt, he'll end with knowledge. This week, Dr. Bronowski considers pattern and growth. The program's introduced by George Steedman.
That was a marvellous day you described, with, on one platform, receiving degrees, a biologist, Gowland Hopkins, Albert Einstein, the physicist, and William Butler Yeats, the poet. The epitome of the time. Not long after that, you, a mathematician, dropped mathematics and spent a year writing poetry.
I suppose that poetry excited me so much because it was English poetry. I enjoy French and Italian poetry, and there are some German poets, chiefly Goethe and Bertolt Brecht, who have an earthy quality in their poetry, which I also like. But mostly I think poetry in other languages is pompous. English is the only language in which poetry has the same marvelous simplicity that science has. English is a very old language. I think it has some of the qualities of languages like Chinese, which have been rubbed for centuries so that the words and dates on the face of the coin are gone. But the pattern of the total layout remains. English is very tight, very precise. You have no business to be speaking it unless you find the right word, and there is a right word. At this very moment, in the act of speaking English, I take a pleasure in forming every sentence. I didn't have that before I came to England. And I find a positive distaste listening to speakers, chiefly politicians, who produce these rotund, ready-made phrases which do not express the very quality of the language.
You used a word just then, pattern, which seems to me a crucial word in the English language for scientific thinking.
I ought to make due acknowledgement of my sources. I think that I learned the word pattern from you years ago. It says that there is, under the appearance of nature, a structure, and that human beings differ from animals in looking for the structure, and not only the appearance. What Elizabethan poets called the skull beneath the skin, the bone. English is a bony language, and the pattern is not the patina, the surface beauty, the nice skin colors, but the actual shape in which the face of a man with a powerful mind is made, the way the brow ridge goes, the way the nose goes. That's what I love about faces and languages and about science.
There was a crucial event in your life when you were asked, as a mathematician, to investigate essentially the pattern of a skull of great antiquity. That idea of mathematical examination of living material and elucidation of knowledge from measuring the pattern of it is also, I think, a 20th century idea.
I should just define for our listeners the fact that mathematics isn't all of one kind. There are some kinds of mathematics that I find very boring. For instance, I'm really not terribly interested in the theory of numbers. I know it's very exciting to ask the question of whether it's true that every even number is the sum of two prime numbers, particularly as it's a question which was asked 200 years ago and to which there still exists no answer. But I don't think of the world as made up of numbers. I think of the world as made up of shapes, what you call patterns. Relationships. I think that you have said something far more interesting when you have said most family quarrels have a triangular shape But most political quarrels have the shape of a simple confrontation between two sides. That's what's wrong with politics. The family is rich because it's triangular. Politics are poor because they're flat. Those seem funny words to use about politics and the family, but to me they say everything. Well, it is true that in 1950 or thereabouts, a very great anthropologist, Le Gros Clark, he's dead, but if anybody's ever going to hold my skull in his hand and look at it, I hope it's Le Gros Clark. Le Gros Clark asked me a question about a skull and about teeth. The teeth of babies that had been found in South Africa. And there were people who said that they were indistinguishable from monkey teeth.
In geological deposits.
Deposits about 2 million years old. And some people said, well, you know, if you measure them, you can't see any difference between these teeth and teeth of little chimpanzees or little other apes. And there were some people, like Le Gros Clark, who said that can't be true. If you give them to me, I can tell that they look like human baby teeth and not like chimp baby teeth. Well, I will tell the honest story. One late afternoon, I was in Le Gros Clark's office flirting with his secretary. And he put his head around the door and he said, I thought it was you. Come and look at some teeth. I was having a very good time looking at her teeth. But in I went, and he showed me some teeth in one hand and some teeth in the other, and he said, do they look alike? And I said, no, these are triangular, these are square. He said, well, these, the triangular ones, are chimpanzee teeth, and these are human teeth. Now I'll show you some fossil teeth, which set do they belong to. And he showed me these fossil baby teeth, and they were obviously square. So I said, well, not any question. He says, people are writing statistical papers telling me that I can't tell them apart when I can tell them apart with my eyes. So I said, well, they're not doing the right kind of mathematics. He said, what kind of mathematics? I said, Greek mathematics. So Greek mathematics is what I did, and I proved in no time flat, with the help of some colleagues who worked with me, that they were clearly distinguishable from any ape teeth, and they were very like any human teeth, including modern human teeth, provided you took into account not only their size by measurement, but their shape. And since then, there's never been any doubt.
And what excitements did you find in your quest for poetry, comparable to that excitement?
You've put your finger absolutely on the excitement that I found. I realized that the 20th century imagination, in all the sciences and in all the arts, has got to have this pictorial, geometrical, scientific quality. That it doesn't matter whether you're talking about painting or about poetry or social relations. We are now afire with a new dimension of our imagination, the Greek dimension, the dimension in which relations become more important than absolute units of measurement. You see, in the 19th century, people really said, if you can measure it, it's science. If you can't measure it, it isn't science. That's not true. If you can make the measurement into a pattern which is coherent, then it's human, whether it's scientific imagination or poetic imagination.
There's an apparent paradox in the fact that you are excited about science, but of course it's 20th century science. And one of your great heroes in poetry is William Blake. You wrote a book about him. And Blake, in fact, was violently against what he saw as Newtonian science and the dark satanic mills.
I'll tell you a frank story about Blake, which is just as frank as my story about Le Gros Clark and his secretary. I had read a good many poets in my learning of English because the poets inspired me. Blake I always found rather boring because the books described him as a sort of Old Testament prophet, very occupied with the religious ideas, which I find very boring, very monotonous. And I saw no variety in him, and particularly I thought here was a man who lived from 1757 to 1827, that is to say, roughly speaking, 200 years ago. And he seems as dead as the dodo. He doesn't seem to have anything to say about modern problems. Well, one fine day, my future wife, who is a sculptor, said to me, I need to have someone to pose for me for a statue that I am making to enter a competition about the unknown political prisoner. Would you pose for me? There were many good reasons why I wished to pose for my future wife for this statue. But it was also clear to me that it was going to be a very long chore. So when I arrived, I said to her, do you have a thick book? And she said, well, I have the poems of Blake. Well, that's a damn thick book, I can tell you. My heart sank. But there I stood in the pose of an unknown political prisoner. And I began to read Blake, and it was marvelous. It was absolutely untrue about his being this Old Testament prophet talking about religion. He was a man profoundly influenced by social ideas. The Industrial Revolution, which went on exactly in those years that he lived, 1757 to 1827, was transforming the world and transforming it in imagination. You see, the strange thing is that here's a man who never went north of Hampstead Heath, never went into the north where the satanic mills really were, but he felt it in his blood and bones. He heard from people what industry was doing, and he wrote these marvelous prophetic verses, which nobody had ever understood, about how men were being made to work for a pittance, they were being made to polish brass and iron, not knowing for what use they were. All the things that we were saying about why production line mechanics was bad. I absolutely fell in love with Blake that day. Just as well, I was already in love with my future wife. I needed something else to do. So it was all very successful. We got married and I wrote a book about Blake, which at that time I simply called William Blake, A Man Without a Mask, but which, whenever it's reprinted now, is always called William Blake and the Age of Revolution. And that's strange, you see, because I hadn't even thought of pointing to the social revolutions in which he lived. But because I wrote it in a time of social revolution, everyone who publishes it now recognizes it as a revolutionary document.
Now, what justification had we for thinking that there was a relationship a century later between modern physics and 19th century doctrines of revolution, which is what were taken over?
Well, it also began at that time. It began at a more curious, abstract scientific level. It began in an examination of scientific theories. It then went on to an examination of scientific history. And the turning point came in an event which is now very little remembered, but which made a deep impression on me and my colleagues in English universities around about 1932. A conference was held in England of young scientists. A number of people came and presented papers about scientists of the past. And a man came from Russia called B. Hessen, and he read a paper to us about the social context of Newton's mathematics. Well, you know, when we saw that on the agenda, we thought he must be potty. The social context of Newton's mathematics? What had mathematics to do with society? Newton was solving problems in astronomy. You know, what could it have to do with it? And there was this little Russian coming up and reading a paper in which he said, England was the leading mercantile power round about the year 1670, when the Royal Society was founded. The main problems of England at that time were finding one's way at sea. The main prizes were offered for navigational instruments. A theory of the heavens and how the stars and the planets behaved was required in order that you should be able to sail from England to Africa, from England to America, and so on. And therefore, every bright young mathematician was being pushed into astronomical theory, and that's how Newton came to write. Well, you know, it was a thunderclap, because it was all true, and the moment it had been said, it was obvious. Didn't tell us much about Newton, who was just as big a crank, an eccentric, a woman-hater, and an unpleasant man as he had been before the paper was read. But by God, it told us something about the context in which men like Newton studied mathematics, and it was an absolute revelation to us. Science, until the 20th century, was mainly preoccupied with what we would now call guidance systems. That is, the stars as a guidance system. If you sail by the stars in a certain way, you'll come to a certain place. The main model of what a scientific machine is was always regarded as the clock. Well, the clock isn't a machine. The clock doesn't do a damn thing. What does the clock do? It tells you the time. That enables you to relate to your latitude, find your way at sea. The clock is a guidance system. Now, towards the end of the 19th century, thermodynamics becomes an important science. In other words, we turn from the idea of a machine as being a clock to the idea of a machine as being a driving mechanism, like a steam engine. That had been going all through the 19th century, but by the beginning of the 20th century it becomes the main preoccupation, the search for power. So the difference between our physics and Newton's physics is a philosophic difference of the kind that we've described. But as a social phenomenon, the difference is between the age of Newton, when you are simply guiding yourself through the world, and the age of the 20th century, when you are not only guiding yourself, but propelling yourself through the world.
That was the late Dr. Jacob Bronowski with the third of 10 conversations with George Steedman.